What would you do if the entire courtroom laughed at you? Not smiled, not whispered, laughed. Imagine standing there, 12 years old, hands shaking, heart pounding so loud you can barely hear your own voice, and the most powerful people in the room don't even take you seriously. That's exactly what happened to a young boy named Daniel. He wasn't there because he broke the law. He wasn't there because he was in trouble. He was there to fight for his grandmother's home. A small house, old wooden floors, a kitchen filled with memories, the only place she had left that still reminded her of her late husband, and a giant development company wanted to take it. When Daniel walked into that courtroom with nothing but a worn-out backpack and a folder full of papers, people thought it was cute. Some thought it was foolish. The judge even laughed. "Son, this is a court of law," he said. The lawyers smirked. Reporters prepared for an easy, forgettable story. The entire room believed this would be over in 5 minutes. But what happened next no one expected, because sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the loudest truth. Within minutes, the laughter faded. Smiles disappeared. Whispers stopped. And the same judge who doubted him would soon be forced to say something no one saw coming. By the end of that day, the courtroom didn't just fall silent. It changed. This isn't just a story about a legal battle. It's about courage when you feel small. It's about standing up when no one believes you. It's about a grandson who refused to watch his grandmother lose everything. And trust me, what that boy reveals in court will leave you speechless. So before we begin, ask yourself, if you were 12 years old and the world laughed at you, would you sit down or would you stand up? Let me tell you what Daniel chose to do. The courtroom doors creaked open with a long, echoing groan, and every head turned at once. It wasn't a famous lawyer walking in. It wasn't a wealthy businessman surrounded by assistants. It was a boy, 12 years old, thin, nervous, but determined. Daniel Carter stepped inside like he didn't fully belong there. His shirt was neatly tucked in, though slightly wrinkled. His sneakers were clean, but clearly worn from years of use. Clutched tightly against his chest was a faded blue backpack, the zipper half broken. The room felt too big for him. Tall wooden walls stretched toward the ceiling. The state flag stood stiffly behind the judge's bench. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, cutting sharp lines across polished floors. Lawyers in dark suits filled the left side of the room. On the right, reporters whispered quietly, flipping open notepads. Daniel swallowed. At the front sat the judge, stern-faced, silver-haired, known for running his courtroom with strict discipline. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. Case number 47B, the clerk announced, Carter versus Westfield Development Group. A murmur rippled through the audience. Westfield Development Group was no small name. They had built half the city's newest skyscrapers. Their representative sat confidently at a long table, their briefcases organized, their expressions calm. Two attorneys in tailored suits reviewed documents without even glancing at Daniel. The judge looked down at the docket, then paused. "Mr. Carter?" he called out. Daniel stepped forward. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge looked around. "And where is your legal representation?" Daniel tightened his grip on his backpack strap. "I'm representing myself, sir." For a moment, there was silence. Then came the laughter. It started as a soft chuckle from somewhere in the back row. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the courtroom was filled with restrained but unmistakable amusement. One of the attorneys from Westfield leaned toward his colleague and whispered something. Both men smirked. The judge didn't laugh loudly, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You're representing yourself?" he repeated. "Yes, Your Honor." "And how old are you, son?" 12. This time, the laughter was restrained. Even a few reporters shook their heads. Someone whispered, "This won't last 5 minutes." Daniel felt the heat rise to his cheeks. His hands trembled slightly, but he forced them still. He had practiced this moment in his bedroom mirror. He had imagined the noise, the doubt, the stares. He had promised himself he wouldn't cry. The judge leaned back in his chair. "Young man, do you understand that you're filing a legal claim against one of the largest development companies in this state?" "Yes, sir." "And you believe you can present a case strong enough to stand in this court?" Daniel hesitated for half a second. not because he doubted himself, but because he chose his words carefully. "I believe the truth can, sir." The courtroom quieted slightly. The judge folded his hands together. "This is not a classroom debate. Legal proceedings require evidence, procedure, and a clear understanding of property law. This isn't something you simply read about online." Daniel nodded respectfully. "I understand." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" Daniel reached slowly into his backpack. The simple action caused another wave of soft chuckles. From inside, he pulled out a thick stack of papers, neatly organized with colored tabs sticking out from the sides. Then another folder, and another. The laughter began to fade, not completely, but enough for curiosity to replace amusement. He laid everything carefully on the small podium in front of him. The judge watched closely now. Daniel took a deep breath and looked up at the bench. Not at the lawyers, not at the reporters, not at the crowd, only at the judge. "My grandmother bought our house 32 years ago," Daniel began, his voice quiet but steady. "She saved money for 12 years to afford it." One of the defense attorneys shifted in his seat, clearly impatient. Daniel continued. "Last year, Westfield Development sent her a notice saying the property was part of a redevelopment zone and would be acquired by the city." The judge glanced at the defense table. "That is standard procedure in approved urban expansion plans." Daniel nodded again. "Yes, sir, but our house wasn't originally in that zone." The courtroom grew a little quieter. Daniel reached for the first folder, but didn't open it yet. "When my grandmother got the notice, she thought it was a mistake," he said. "She went to the city office. They told her everything was legal, that the zoning maps had been updated." He paused. "She doesn't understand maps or zoning laws. She just knows a house is the only place she has left that still feels like home." A few people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. The judge's expression remained serious, but no longer amused. "And what does this have to do with you representing yourself?" the judge asked. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the podium. "Because she couldn't afford a lawyer," he replied. "And I didn't think it was fair that nobody explained things to her." There was no dramatic music, no raised voice, just honesty. The courtroom no longer felt entertained. It felt attentive. One reporter slowly lowered her pen, now fully listening. The judge studied Daniel for a long moment. "You do understand," he said slowly, "that emotions are not evidence?" "Yes, sir," Daniel answered immediately. "That's why I brought evidence." The room became still again. The judge exhaled through his nose. "You may proceed," he said, though his tone carried a trace of skepticism. Daniel nodded. He carefully opened the first folder, revealing property tax receipts, photocopies of old documents, highlighted sections, handwritten notes in the margins. He had spent weeks after school in the public library. He had asked librarians how to search public records. He had taken notes while his friends played outside. He had read articles he barely understood at first, until he understood them. The lawyers across the room no longer smiled quite as confidently. The judge adjusted his glasses again. "Very well, Mr. Carter," he said. "You have 5 minutes." Daniel looked down at his papers, then back up. 5 minutes. That was all anyone believed he deserved. The courtroom waited, half expecting him to stumble, to freeze, to prove them right. But Daniel Carter didn't look scared anymore. He looked ready. And though most people in that room didn't realize it yet, the laughter had already started to disappear. Daniel adjusted the microphone slightly. The soft screech of feedback echoed through the courtroom before fading into silence. 5 minutes. That was all he had. He looked down at the first document in front of him, then back at the judge. "My grandmother purchased our home on May 14th, 32 years ago," Daniel began, his voice steadier now. "I have a certified copy of the original deed." He lifted the paper carefully, almost respectfully, as if it were something fragile and sacred. The bailiff stepped forward, collected it, and handed it to the judge. The judge glanced at it briefly. Daniel didn't rush. He knew rushing would make him sound nervous. "She paid off the mortgage in 15 years, he continued. "And since then, she has paid property taxes every single year. On time." He held up a thick stack of receipts. The edges were slightly yellow with age. "I organized them by year," Daniel added quietly. A faint whisper moved through the courtroom. Organized, the bailiff passed the stack forward again. The judge flipped through a few pages. Each receipt had dates, official stamps, signatures. Daniel continued before anyone could interrupt. Last year, in March, Westfield Development submitted a proposal for the Riverside Expansion Project. One of the defense attorneys shifted in his chair. They claimed several properties fell inside a newly defined redevelopment zone, Daniel said, including ours. The attorney stood up. Your Honor, the redevelopment zone was approved by the City Council. This child is misrepresenting. Sit. The judge said sharply, not looking up from the papers. The attorney hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Daniel's hands were still shaking slightly, but his voice was gaining strength. I went to the city records office, he said. I asked for the zoning maps from before the project. He reached for a large rolled-up sheet beside him. A few people leaned forward in their seats. Daniel carefully unrolled the first map across the podium. It was worn but clear, with colored boundary lines marking property zones. This is the official zoning map from 5 years ago, he explained. Our house is here. He pointed to a small square near the edge of a blue-line district. The bailiff carried the map to the judge. And this, Daniel said, pulling out a second map, newer and brighter, is the updated version approved 6 months ago. The second map was handed forward. Even from a distance, the difference was visible. The judge placed both maps side by side. The courtroom grew completely still. The red redevelopment boundary line had shifted, not by a mile, not even by a street, by exactly 6 feet. 6 feet that now covered Daniel's grandmother's property. Daniel swallowed but kept going. I measured it using the scale printed at the bottom of the map, he explained. The shift includes only 3 properties on the entire block. He paused. Ours is one of them. A murmur rippled through the spectators. The judge leaned closer, comparing both maps carefully. Daniel reached into his folder again. I also requested public records of project proposals, he said. This is a copy of Westfield Development's initial construction plan. The paper was passed forward. It was submitted 3 months before the zoning map was changed. Now the defense attorney shot to his feet. Objection. Correlation does not imply wrongdoing. Urban plans often precede zoning updates. Counsel. The judge interrupted, his tone colder now. You will have your turn. The attorney slowly sat down again, but his confidence was visibly cracking. Daniel continued. The construction plan already includes our property within the development boundary, he said. Before the city officially moved the zoning line, the words hung in the air. The judge's fingers tapped lightly against the bench. Daniel could feel the room shifting. The earlier amusement had completely vanished. In its place was something else. Attention. Serious attention. I know I'm not a lawyer, Daniel said softly, but I learned that zoning changes require public notice and hearings. He lifted another sheet. This is the public notice posted for our area. The judge reviewed it quickly. The hearing was scheduled at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, Daniel continued. My grandmother works mornings cleaning offices downtown. She never saw the notice. He hesitated. It was posted on a telephone pole 2 streets away. A few people in the gallery exchanged glances. Daniel took a breath. I asked our neighbors if they knew about the hearing, he added. 2 of them signed written statements, saying they didn't. He held up signed pages. The defense attorneys were no longer smiling. One of them whispered urgently to the other. The judge now looked directly at Daniel. Are you suggesting, he said slowly, that the zoning adjustment was orchestrated to align with a pre-existing construction plan? Daniel nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The room felt heavier. Even the reporters had stopped typing. The judge leaned back in his chair, staring at the timeline laid out before him. Original map, 5 years ago. Construction proposal, 9 months ago. Zoning shift, 6 months ago. Eviction notice, from months ago. The sequence was clear. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to speak one more time. My grandmother didn't fight it, he said quietly. She thought if the city said it was legal, then it must be. His voice trembled slightly, but not from fear. She told me maybe it was just time to move on. He looked down for a moment, then back up but I didn't think it was right. The simplicity of those words cut deeper than any legal argument. The judge removed his glasses slowly. "Did anyone assist you in gathering this documentation?" he asked. "No, sir," Daniel replied. "The librarian showed me how to request public records, but I did the research myself." A long silence followed. The defense team shuffled papers, clearly searching for something, anything, to counter the timeline. But the damage had already been done. The laughter from earlier felt like it had happened hours ago. Now, every eye in the courtroom was fixed on a 12-year-old boy who had done what no one expected him to do. He had connected the dots. He had asked questions adults were too intimidated to ask. And he had brought proof. The judge leaned forward, his voice measured. "This court will take a 15-minute recess." The gavel struck. But as the sound echoed through the room, one thing was undeniable. The case that had begun as a source of quiet amusement had just become a serious legal problem. And the boy no one had taken seriously had just changed everything. The sound of the gavel echoed like a warning. "This court will take a 15-minute recess." The judge stood and disappeared through the wooden door behind the bench. The moment it closed, the entire courtroom exploded into whispers, but not laughter, not anymore. The defense attorneys huddled together urgently. Their polished confidence had cracked. One flipped rapidly through a binder. The other rubbed his forehead, whispering in sharp, frustrated tones. Across the room, reporters were no longer bored observers. Phones were out. Messages were being sent. A story that had started as a human interest curiosity was turning into something much bigger. Daniel remained at the podium for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then he slowly gathered his papers, placing them back into careful stacks. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, from adrenaline. He hadn't planned beyond this point. He hadn't imagined what would happen if the judge actually took him seriously. From the back row, an elderly woman stood slowly. Daniel's grandmother. She had been quiet the entire time, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her gray hair was tied neatly in a bun. She walked toward him, her step small but determined. "You did good," she whispered. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes glassy but strong. "I just told the truth," he replied. 15 minutes felt like an hour. When the courtroom doors opened again and the judge returned, the air changed instantly. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Everyone rose. The judge sat down slowly, his face unreadable. Daniel stood straight at the front. The defense attorneys tried to regain their composure, but something was different now. The easy smirks were gone. Their shoulders were tighter, their movements more cautious. The judge adjusted his microphone. "Be seated." The room obeyed. He looked first at the defense table. "Counsel," he began, his tone controlled but firm. "The timeline presented by the plaintiff raises serious procedural questions." The word plaintiff echoed in the room. Plaintiff, not the boy, not this child. The plaintiff. The judge continued. "The zoning adjustment appears to have occurred after construction proposal that already included the Carter property within redevelopment boundaries." The defense attorney stood carefully this time. "Your Honor, urban planning processes are complex. Preliminary drafts often. Were public notices properly distributed?" The judge interrupted. The attorney hesitated. "They were posted in accordance with minimum city requirements." "Minimum," the judge repeated. Silence followed. The judge turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Carter." Daniel straightened. "Yes, Your Honor. You have presented preliminary documentation suggesting potential irregularities in the zoning revision process." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle across the room. This court cannot ignore that. The defense attorneys exchanged a quick glance. The judge folded his hands. "Therefore, this court orders an immediate suspension of any eviction proceedings concerning the Carter property until a full review is conducted." A soft gasp escaped from somewhere in the gallery. Daniel blinked. Had he heard that correctly? The judge continued. "Furthermore, the city planning department will be required to provide a complete record of communications, submissions, and approvals related to the Riverside expansion project." Now the room was completely silent. Not even whispers. The kind of silence that feels heavy. The defense attorney stood again, tension clear in his voice. "Your Honor, Such a review could delay the entire project. If the project was conducted properly, the judge replied sharply, then you have nothing to fear. The attorney slowly sat down. The judge leaned back in his chair and looked directly at Daniel. For a moment, the authority of the bench faded, and what remained was something more human. Young man, he said, earlier today, I allowed this courtroom to treat your presence lightly. Daniel's heart pounded. That was an error in judgment. The words seemed to hang in the air. The judge removed his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench. You have demonstrated preparation, composure, and a clear understanding of the documents you presented. He paused. Justice does not depend on age. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. The same room that had laughed less than an hour ago was now completely still. I commend you for standing on behalf of your grandmother. The judge finished. Daniel felt something rise in his chest. Not pride exactly, but relief. His grandmother covered her mouth with her hand, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. The judge struck the gavel once more. This session is adjourned pending investigation. And just like that, it was over. But the story was only beginning. Over the next several weeks, investigators reviewed the zoning changes. Emails were examined. Approval timelines were scrutinized. Meeting minutes were requested. Reporters ran headlines that spread across the city. Boy challenges developers in court. 12-year-old forces review of major project. Public attention grew quickly. Community members began asking questions about other properties included in the expansion zone. Then the findings came. The zoning adjustment had been expedited through an internal recommendation just weeks after the construction proposal was drafted. Required notices had technically been posted, but in locations unlikely to be seen by affected residents. While not outright criminal, the process had clearly favored development speed over homeowner transparency. The project was paused. Revisions were ordered, and Daniel's grandmother's home? It remained exactly where it had always been. Safe, untouched. One evening, Daniel sat at the small kitchen table inside that very house. The same wooden cabinets, the same ticking clock on the wall, the same faded curtains by the window. His grandmother placed a plate of warm food in front of him. You didn't just save this house, she said softly. You reminded people to look closer. Daniel shrugged slightly, embarrassed by the attention the story had received. I just didn't want you to lose it, he said. Outside, the city lights glowed in the distance. Construction cranes stood frozen for now. Back in the courtroom, people still talked about that day. Not because a major company had been challenged, not because a judge had ordered an investigation, but because a small boy with a worn-out backpack had stood alone at the front of Courtroom and refused to sit down when others laughed. The silence that followed his final words wasn't empty. It was filled with something stronger than laughter, respect, and that silence spoke louder than anything else ever could.